Every generation of Americans has faced a war that shaped its destiny. From the smoke of revolution to the deserts of the Middle East, the United States has fought not just for land or power, but for an idea, the idea of freedom. This is the story of how a fledgling colony became a global superpower through blood, courage, and unyielding will. This is the story of American wars, from independence to the War on Terror. And in every battle, from the forests of New York to the sands of Fallujah, one question echoes through history. What does freedom cost?
In the spring of 1775, the world saw America as a handful of rebellious colonies, scattered settlements under the shadow of the British Crown. But beyond the quiet farms and cobblestone streets, something was stirring, a whisper of defiance that would soon roar into revolution. For years, the colonies had lived under British rule, taxed, monitored, and dismissed. But the events of one fateful night in Massachusetts would ignite a war that would change the course of human history.
April 19, 1775. British troops marched from Boston toward Concord, tasked with seizing colonial weapons and arresting leaders of the resistance. But waiting for them were local farmers, ordinary men with extraordinary courage. At Lexington Green, 77 colonists stood their ground. Someone, history never agreed on who, fired a single shot. That shot echoed across continents. It was the shot heard round the world. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead. But instead of submission, the colonies found something far more powerful: unity.
The message from Massachusetts reached Philadelphia fast. The Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775. Among them stood men whose names would echo through time: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington. It was Washington, a tall, stoic Virginian, who was chosen to lead the newly formed Continental Army. He had no illusions. The British Empire had the finest military on earth, well-trained, well-funded, and well-fed. The Americans had none of that. What they did have was belief. Belief in liberty. Belief that a people could govern themselves without a king. In June 1775, colonial forces besieged British troops in Boston. On a nearby hill, they built fortifications overnight, a position that would soon become legendary. When the British advanced on Bunker Hill, they expected an easy victory. But when they charged, the colonists waited until they could see the whites of their eyes. 3 assaults later, the British finally took the hill, but at a terrible cost. Over 1,000 of their men were killed or wounded. The colonists had lost the ground, but gained something greater: confidence. The message was clear: the Americans could fight.
By 1776, rebellion was no longer a whisper, it was a cause. On July 4th, delegates of the Continental Congress signed a document that would forever change the world: the Declaration of Independence. It was not just a separation from Britain, it was a declaration of human dignity. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. words that would outlive every gun and every general. But for those on the battlefield, independence would come at a terrible cost. By late 1777, Washington's army was battered and broken. After defeats in New York and Philadelphia, they took shelter at Valley Forge. The winter was cruel. Soldiers wrapped their feet in rags. Food was scarce. Disease spread. Yet out of that frozen misery, a nation's army was reborn. A Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben arrived and drilled the troops with iron discipline. By spring, Washington's men marched with new purpose, forged not by victory, but by endurance. The revolution was no longer a dream. It was a determination.
In 1777, the British launched a plan to split the colonies in two, advancing south from Canada. But at Saratoga, in upstate New York, American forces led by General Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold stopped them cold. The British surrendered more than 5,000 men. It was a stunning victory, the first major turning point of the war. And across the Atlantic, it sent a message France had been waiting for. For 2 years, the Americans had fought alone. Now, with the victory at Saratoga, France formally entered the war, bringing ships, money, and soldiers. The revolution was no longer just America's fight. It had become a global war.
From the Caribbean to India, the British Empire found itself stretched thin. French fleets harassed British ships. Spain and the Dutch Republic joined in. What began as a colonial rebellion had turned into a worldwide conflict. And back in America, Washington seized the moment to strike.
In 1781, the British Army, under General Cornwallis, moved into Yorktown, Virginia. Washington saw his chance. With help from French General Rochambeau and Admiral de Grasse, Washington encircled the British on land and sea. For weeks, cannon fire rained on Yorktown. Finally, on October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The war, for all intents, was over. When the news reached London, the British Parliament voted to end hostilities. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Against impossible odds, the colonies had won their independence.
But independence was not the end. It was only the beginning. The war had cost more than 25,000 American lives, nearly 1% of the entire population. Towns were burned, families divided. The new nation was broke, fragile, and uncertain. Yet from that wreckage emerged something the world had never seen, a republic built on the promise of liberty. In the ashes of revolution, the United States of America was born.
The War of Independence was more than a fight against a king. It was the world's first experiment in democracy, a gamble on the belief that ordinary people could rule themselves. The revolution didn't just create a new nation, it created a new idea that freedom was worth fighting for. But as America would soon learn, freedom always comes at a price, and that price was war.
This was Chapter 1 of the Story of American Wars. If you believe history should never be forgotten, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because in the next episode, we'll uncover how the young United States faced its first great test against the British Empire once again in the War of 1812.